Sometimes, a story begins not with a choice, but with a moment life forces upon us. And sometimes the quietest creature caught in the middle becomes the one who teaches us what loyalty, presence, and endurance really mean. Before anyone knew her name, before anyone imagined she could trust again, a small abandoned bobcat faced a fire that seemed determined to erase everything in its path. The high country of northern Arizona had been waiting for rain that never came. Summer stretched thin, days hot enough to crack the soil, nights dry enough for pine needles to crumble under a single fingertip. By late August, the forest felt like a photograph left too long in the sun. Faded, brittle, holding its breath. On a Wednesday afternoon, lightning found the weakest tree on a south-facing ridge. Within minutes, a curl of smoke lifted into the sky. Within an hour, that smoke turned into a long gray column, twisting upward, like a warning no one could ignore. Fire crews called it a fast mover, those fires that don't walk, don't pause, don't wait for anything human. They run. In less than a day, flames had already crossed multiple canyons, moving through the dry underbrush with a hunger that felt almost personal. Birds scattered in frantic spirals. Mule deer fled in herds that looked more like shadows than animals. Every creature from foxes to field mice searched for any path that didn't smell of burning resin. But not all of them could run. And one young bobcat would soon become the quiet center of a story none of the rescuers, not even the firefighter who hadn't yet appeared, could have predicted. The first sighting came just after sunrise, when the fire had slowed enough for crews to search the affected outskirts. A rancher, checking his fence line for damage, saw something move near the collapsed remains of an old storage shed. At first, he thought it was a patch of smoke shifting in the wind. Then he realized it wasn't moving with the breeze. It was moving on its own. He stepped closer and felt his stomach clench. A small bobcat, maybe a year old, maybe younger, crouched under a warped metal panel, her fur ash-dusted, her breathing shallow. Her paws were tucked tightly beneath her body, as if hiding them could pretend away the burns. Her eyes, once wild amber, were clouded with something deeper than fear. Not defiance, not aggression. Something much heavier. A kind of shutting down. Wild animals usually choose flight or fight, but sometimes, especially when overwhelmed by heat, smoke, and sudden changes, they enter a third state, the freeze response. A biological safeguard that says if I don't move, maybe the world can't reach me. For prey animals, it's a last attempt at survival. For predators, it's a sign that something inside has already broken. This little bobcat didn't hiss, didn't growl, didn't even lift her head. She simply folded into herself, as if hoping the world would just look past her. The rancher knew he couldn't handle this alone. He radioed for help, and within 20 minutes, 2 wildlife volunteers arrived with a humane trap and thick gloves. They spoke softly, moved slowly, and kept a respectful distance. But the bobcat refused everything. Water, gentle coaxing, even the space offered by an open crate. She didn't resist. She didn't flee. And that was the part that frightened them most. Animals survive by choosing something. Attack, retreat, bluff, speed. This one chose nothing. The volunteers covered her with a smoke-scented towel to lift her safely. As they did, the bobcat didn't flinch. She only closed her eyes, almost like a final surrender. Later, they would call her Sable, a name chosen because her coat, beneath the soot and burns, still held a soft reddish-brown hue. But in that moment, she wasn't a symbol or a lesson. She was simply a wounded wild soul who had run out of places to hide. The drive to the wildlife center took an hour. The road wound through patches of forest, where green still showed between the burn scars. Small, stubborn reminders of life. One volunteer whispered, "Hang in there, little one." Though she wasn't sure if Sable could hear her, the bobcat stayed still the entire ride, body locked, ears pressed flat, eyes open but distant. It's remarkable how an animal can appear both present and gone at the same time. At the center, the staff paused the moment they saw her. They treated hawks with scorched feathers, raccoons burned trying to escape culverts, even deer fawns separated from their mothers. But this was different. The wounds were serious, yes, but the spirit looked almost extinguished. Dr. Evelyn Harper, who'd worked with wildlife for 18 years, touched the crate lightly with one knuckle. "This isn't fear," she murmured. "This is withdrawal. She's refusing to exist in front of us." It was a gentle observation, but everyone felt the weight of it. The center itself was stretched thin. That month, donations had run low, and the staff were rotating extra shifts because so many hands were needed and so few were available. Nights blurred into mornings, and nobody remembered the last time the break room coffee pot had been full. Still, they followed the same promise they'd made to countless animals before Sable. As long as she was willing to keep breathing, they were willing to keep trying. They examined her carefully. Burns along the paws, singed whiskers, patches of fur missing where the heat had seared too close. But the injuries weren't the most concerning part. The real wound was the way she ignored the world. No curiosity, no spark, no instinct to defend herself. Her heartbeat remained steady, but her eyes never followed movement. Trauma affects wild animals deeply. In felines especially, scent memory plays a powerful role. A single smell, burned pine, hot metal, smoke, can trigger the body to shut down long before the mind understands what's happening. And for Sable, everything around her smelled like the fire that nearly took her life. A volunteer placed a dish of water a foot from her crate. She didn't move. Another offered a piece of chicken. The same. Hours passed, and the bobcat remained frozen, as if carved from the ash that clung to her fur. But there was one moment, a small thing, barely visible, that kept the staff from losing hope. Late that night, when the hallway lights had been dimmed and most of the center had fallen quiet, a young volunteer named Nora walked by with a laundry basket of towels. As she passed Sable's crate, she whispered, "You're safe here." She didn't expect anything, didn't pause long enough to search for a response. But on the security camera, when the timestamp flicked from 10:42 to 10:43, Sable's ear shifted, just a fraction. A single tiny acknowledgement that the world was still reaching for her. Sometimes, healing starts with the smallest motion, one only visible if you look closely enough. In the middle of a disaster, some creatures fight, others flee, but the ones who freeze often carry the ache of survival the longest. Sable wasn't refusing them out of stubbornness. She was refusing the world because she no longer trusted it to hold her safely. And yet, even a tiny ear flick can be a kind of hope, a soft reminder that somewhere inside, a spark is still alive. People often think resilience looks like strength or boldness, but sometimes it looks like a small bobcat, taking a single breath of air she's not sure she wants, or a volunteer whispering comfort to a creature who might never understand the words, but might still feel the warmth. Healing rarely announces itself. It shows up quietly, in whispers and fractions. If hearing Sable's first steps towards survival touches something in you, stay with this story. There's more ahead, more courage, more kindness, and one moment that changed everything. Because long before the firefighter knelt beside her, before the unthinkable act that would reshape both their lives, the Wildlife Center had to face a question no one wanted to say aloud. How do you reach an animal who has given up on being reached? Some places never make the news, yet they carry the weight of quiet miracles every day. And when a wounded bobcat like Sable arrives at their door, silent, shut down, unwilling to trust a single soul, those small, Unseen rooms become the front line between giving up and holding on. If you drove past the Northern Arizona Wildlife Relief Center, you might overlook it entirely. It sat beyond a gravel turnout, half hidden under tall junipers that leaned like old guardians. The building wasn't big, and it wasn't new. A few windows fogged from the inside, a porch light that buzzed on colder nights. Simple, unremarkable. The kind of place you'd only notice if you needed somewhere to bring a hurt creature. Inside, though, everything moved with purpose. By the time Sable arrived, the center had already gone 3 weeks without a full night's sleep. Volunteers traded shifts like puzzle pieces, someone covering the early dawn feedings, someone else watching over the owls recovering from wing fractures, another preparing formula for the fox kits that cried whenever storms came close. Donations had dropped that month, which meant every supply was rationed. Gauze, fluids, burn cream, even canned food. It wasn't a place running on convenience, it was running on devotion. Dr. Evelyn Harper walked in that morning with a cup of instant coffee, steam rising in thin threads. She paused at the sight of Sable curled in the crate, body motionless, breath shallow, eyes vacant as if she were watching something far away. "She's young," one volunteer whispered, kneeling. "And heartbroken," another added quietly. "Trauma in wild animals doesn't behave the way people expect. You can treat burns and bandage wounds, but the invisible injury, the one that sits behind the eyes, often determines whether an animal survives. When a predator experiences something overwhelming, especially fire, the body sometimes enters what biologists call behavioral withdrawal. Not aggression, not fear. A kind of internal retreat. It's a survival mechanism, but also a sign of deep distress. Their world shrinks down to the smallest possible space, a corner, a dark crate, an instinct to disappear. And that was Sable. She had refused water, refused food, refused every attempt at comfort. Her ears pinned flat at the slightest sound. Her shoulders tightened whenever anyone stepped near the door. Her gaze dark and distant. No snarl, no swipe, just refusal. A kind that felt like it came from the soul. Nora Jensen, the youngest volunteer, gentle voice, careful hands, took it upon herself to check on Sable every 2 hours. One night, around 1:15 a.m., she carried in a fresh blanket warmed in the dryer. The hallway was quiet, lit only by a faint nightlight shaped like a pine tree. Nora set the blanket just inside the crate door and whispered, "You don't have to be strong tonight. Just breathe." She didn't touch Sable, didn't reach in, just offered presence. When she reviewed the hallway camera later, she noticed something so small she almost missed it. As Nora walked away, Sable's tail twitched. Not curiosity, not comfort, but a sign her body was still participating in the world, even if her mind wasn't ready. In a place where so many creatures arrive broken, tiny movements become milestones. The center had seen countless animals, but Sable presented a difficult question, one they tried not to speak aloud. What if she's too far gone inside? What if she doesn't want to come back to the world? Yet every day they kept trying, because some stories ask for more patience than others. Dr. Harper mixed a nutrient slurry and placed it inside the crate, hoping the smell might spark instinct. Another volunteer sat a few feet away, reading softly, letting her voice act like a gentle anchor. Someone else brought a scrap of pine bark from the forest. Familiar scents sometimes helped traumatized cats reorient themselves. Still no response. Sable stayed curled, motionless, her gaze locked on something only she could see. It wasn't defiance. It was survival by disappearing. There is a particular heaviness in caring for a creature who won't look at you. It asks for a kind of love that expects nothing back. A kind that understands healing can happen long before trust appears on the surface. The staff knew Sable didn't dislike them. She simply no longer believed the world had space for her. But even a creature who has shut down can feel sincerity. They can hear the softness in a human voice. They can sense patience. And sometimes, that becomes the faint thread that keeps them tethered. If you've ever cared for someone, human or animal, who was grieving, you might understand the feeling. You stand nearby, offering presence without pressure, waiting for the moment their spirit decides it's safe to return. Sable's spirit hadn't returned. Not yet. But something inside her had not let go entirely. People often imagine wildlife rehabilitation is filled with dramatic rescues and happy endings. The truth is quieter, more human, more raw. It's late night shifts, smoothing a blanket that an animal may never touch. It's filling forms at 4 a.m. with tired eyes. It's wiping down tables while whispering hopes into rooms where no one answers. It's looking at a bobcat who refuses every rescuer and choosing to believe there's still something worth reaching for. The center wasn't trying to tame Sable or turn her into a pet or rewrite her nature. They simply wanted to give her a chance to be wild again, to feel love in the form of kindness, loyalty, and presence. The kind of quiet compassion that rarely makes headlines, but keeps the world humane. And though they didn't know it yet, Sable wasn't waiting for more hands or more medicine. She was waiting for a particular presence, a specific scent, a voice she had once heard through the roar of the flames. The staff had done everything right, but some stories don't move until the missing piece walks through the door. And that missing piece was already on his way, though no one at the center knew it. A firefighter named Liam Carter, carrying smoke on his clothing and a weight on his heart, would soon step into that quiet hallway and see the bobcat who had refused. Everyone. What happened next would change both of them. If this journey of courage, gentleness, and second chances is speaking to you, stay with me. The moment Liam kneels beside Sable is one you won't forget. Before Sable ever looked up at a human again, before she found the one person she would slowly trust, there was a man who moved through his days like someone walking inside a dream he couldn't wake from. A man who could save others, but not himself. And sometimes, that is where the truest part of a story begins. Not in the fire, but in the quiet aftermath no one sees. Most people imagine firefighters in moments of heat and urgency, charging into danger, shouting commands, moving with purpose. But the truth of Liam Carter's life, lived between those moments, was quieter, smaller, more solitary. He lived in a modest cabin, tucked against the edge of a ponderosa stand. The kind of place where the morning light filtered through branches like soft gold dust. Inside, everything had its place. Boots by the door, jacket hung carefully, tools lined up on a wooden peg rail. And still, it always felt as though the cabin belonged to someone who was never fully there. For months after the wildfire, Liam slept poorly. Not from noise. His nights were still. The problem was the silence itself. Because quiet has a way of letting old memories walk freely. The sound that woke him most often wasn't the roar of flames. It was the faint, almost imagined cry of an animal he hadn't reached in time. In sleep, the scenes came back to him as vividly as the night they happened. Smoke thick enough to sting his eyes. Ash snowing down like gray feathers. Shadows of animals, scattering with nowhere left to run. And always, that last moment. The one where he had to turn back. Firefighters are trained to accept that some things cannot be saved. But knowing it and living with it are not the same. Guilt after traumatic events, especially among first responders, doesn't always show up as sorrow. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, an inability to sit still, to fully arrive in one's own life. Sometimes it shows up as hypervigilance or unpredictable tension, or waking from a dream, feeling like you've just run a mile. And sometimes, guilt becomes a kind of loyalty to the past, a way of holding on to the very moments that hurt them most. That was Liam's form of guilt. Loyalty to memories he wished he could change. He wasn't broken. He wasn't fragile. He was simply a man who hadn't put down what he carried. One morning, long before the sun rose, Liam stood on his porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands. The forest still smelled faintly of smoke, even weeks after the fire. Every morning breeze carried reminders: burned pine resin, charred soil, the bitter tang of scorched earth. They weren't overpowering scents anymore. They were the kind that linger, the sort you feel more than smell. As he stared toward the ridge, he remembered a moment from the worst night of the fire. A small shape had darted across the burning slope, too quick to identify through the smoke. He remembered the way it stumbled, the way it paused as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. He ran toward it, but the wind shifted. The heat blew back across the trail, and he was forced to turn away. He always wondered if it survived, and he always believed the answer was no. It was a single moment in a night full of tragedies, but that one stayed with him, not because he had failed, but because it had been so close. That's how guilt works, sometimes. It clings to the almosts. Later that day, Liam drove to the ranger station to file reports about areas still unsafe. Places where fallen logs and unstable soil made the trails dangerous. The administrative tasks were simple, but his hands were tired. Not from the job. He had strength for that. From the memories he kept picking up and carrying, day after day. When he stepped inside the station, another ranger lifted a hand and said, "Morning, Liam. Long night?" "Like usual," he answered with a gentle shrug. But everyone knew what usual meant for him this season. There's a particular ache in carrying responsibility without having anywhere to set it down. Many people know this feeling. The quiet weight that follows loss or fear or near misses. It isn't loud, and it doesn't ask for attention. It simply lives alongside you, a shadow that walks at your pace. Liam wasn't seeking redemption. He wasn't trying to erase what had happened. He only wanted to feel like himself again, to wake up rested, to breathe without heaviness, to let the forest be a place of peace instead of a reminder of everything he couldn't control. And that longing, gentle and unspoken, was part of what made his story so deeply human. Firefighters are often celebrated for bravery, for decisive moments, for the flash of action. But the healing that happens afterward rarely gets noticed. It's slower, more fragile. It takes humility to admit that the quiet hours can be the hardest part. It takes courage to keep showing up for work when the memories follow you into every morning and every dream. And it takes something unexpected, sometimes a connection with a creature who carries her own silent wounds, to change the rhythm of a life that has been stuck between exhaustion and hope. Liam didn't know it yet, but the wildfire that had scarred the hillside had also left behind a survivor who remembered his scent, his voice, and perhaps the faint outline of his presence through smoke. Trauma leaves strange traces on land, on people, on animals. Sometimes those traces bring the wounded back together. On his way home that afternoon, Liam stopped at the turnout near the old storage shed that had collapsed during the fire. The ground was still blackened. Grass hadn't yet dared to return. He walked slowly, his boots leaving shallow prints in the soot. At the edge of the clearing he crouched, close to the ground, quiet. A gesture he would later repeat without thinking. He reached down and picked up a scrap of half-burned cedar. Its scent was soft but unmistakable. A reminder, a question, a thread connecting something unnamed. He kept the piece of cedar without knowing why. Some part of him felt it mattered. By the end of that week, Liam would find himself driving toward the wildlife center. Not because he expected to help, not because he felt ready, but because he heard there were injured animals needing assessment in the burn zone. A simple errand, a routine visit, But inside that small, overworked center waited a bobcat who had refused every rescuer, every voice, every attempt at kindness. Until the moment she heard him, until the moment he knelt, and something in both of them recognized the other. If you're feeling the quiet pull of this connection between a man carrying guilt and a bobcat carrying fear, stay with me. The moment they meet is where the heart of this story begins to shift. Gently, but irrevocably. Sometimes trust isn't built. It simply awakens, like an ember remembering it was once a flame. And in a quiet hallway of a small wildlife center, a tired firefighter knelt. Not to tame a wild creature, not to prove anything at all, but simply to offer presence. What happened next was so small you might have missed it. Yet it changed everything. The morning Liam arrived at the wildlife center was overcast, the kind of soft gray that quiets a landscape. He hadn't planned on staying long. He was only there to drop off a report about injured animals near the burn zone, a routine task he'd done dozens of times before. He walked in carrying the faint, familiar scent of smoke embedded into his jacket, the kind that lingers no matter how many times you wash it. Inside, the building was hushed, not silent. Centers like this never truly rest, but subdued. The soft hum of a heating lamp, the rustle of blankets being folded, a nurse whispering to a recovering hawk. It was a world held together by steady hands and quiet devotion. Liam set the folder on the front counter. "Just updating you on the ridge assessments," he said gently. The volunteer on duty, Nora, still a little sleepless from the week, looked up. "Liam, since you're here, there's someone you should see." She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. There was a tone in her voice that carried both worry and a thin strand of hope. She led him down the long hallway where the lights were dimmed to ease the animal's stress. As they walked, they passed small rooms. A fox kit curled under a heat pad, a fawn with bandaged legs, a raccoon sleeping in a towel-lined crate. Every doorway whispered its own story. Then Nora stopped in front of the isolation room. "She won't let us reach her," she murmured. "Won't look at us, won't eat unless the building is silent. It's like she's somewhere else entirely." She hesitated, then added, "But maybe you should try." Liam felt a quiet shift inside him. Not fear, not even curiosity. Something softer, like recognition. He stepped into the room. Sable lay in the farthest corner of her crate, her body tight as wire, ears pinned back. She looked smaller than he expected, as though fear had compressed her, pressing her spirit into a single trembling shape. For a moment, Liam simply stood there, letting the air settle. Then he did something no one else had done. He knelt. Not quickly, not with the kind of boldness a firefighter might use on duty. He lowered himself slowly, one knee, then the other, until he was level with the ground. He placed his gloves beside him, palms open, fingers relaxed. A gesture that said, "I'm not here to take anything from you." He didn't reach toward the bobcat, didn't call her name, didn't make eye contact yet. He just breathed, long, steady breaths, the kind you take when standing near a frightened animal in the woods, where every movement matters. For a while, nothing happened. The only sound was the low hum of the air purifier and the faint rustle of a distant blanket. Liam rested one hand lightly on the floor, close enough to be a presence, far enough to offer freedom. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough for the words to float across the room like a warm breeze. "I think we've seen the same fire," he whispered. His voice had a texture Sable recognized, low, calm, steady. He had the same voice he used in the forest, on the night he had run toward a small shape struggling through the smoke. A voice he didn't know she had heard, a voice she didn't know she had kept. Trauma has a strange way of storing sound. Wild animals often remember tone long after they forget faces, and predators especially bobcats, rely on scent memory even more. Liam's jacket still held the charred cedar from the ridge. His boots still carried the faint dust of burned soil. His breath still carried the smoke he'd lived in for weeks. To Sable, it wasn't danger. It wasn't comfortable either. It was familiarity. A thin thread of something she had lost. When the fire was at its worst, there had been a moment, brief but real, when Liam had lifted a fallen branch near the creek bed, trying to free a trapped animal. He hadn't been sure what he saw through the smoke, only that something small had moved. The wind had forced him back before he could reach it. He never knew what happened afterward, but Sable had remembered the sound of the branch lifting, the rumble of his voice telling her, "Easy, I've got you." The scent of smoke on his gear as he turned away when he had no choice. She had carried all of it inside her, even through the haze of pain and fear. So when Liam knelt in that quiet room, the recognition wasn't conscious. It was instinct, a faint stirring in the deep part of her brain that handled survival and scent. She didn't move toward him. She didn't ease her body, but her ears, those small expressive points of wildness, shifted. Just slightly, just enough. It was the first response she had given anyone. Sometimes, two wounded spirits recognize each other without understanding why. A man haunted by the ones he couldn't save. A bobcat who believed no one would ever reach her again. Both carrying a loneliness shaped by fire. Both are hiding it behind silence. Liam didn't know he was helping her. Sable didn't know she was helping him. But healing rarely begins with knowledge. It begins with presence. A shared breath. A moment. People often think healing happens in big cinematic moments, dramatic breakthroughs, sudden transformations. But the truth is quieter, more intimate. Learning is the moment a bobcat moves one ear toward a man she doesn't understand. It's the moment a firefighter, unable to sleep for months, feels something soften in the air around him. It's the unspoken recognition that says, "You've been hurt too. Maybe we don't have to face it alone." This is kindness in its most soulful form. This is the seed of love for the wild. This is the loyalty that grows between two beings with no words between them. Slowly, Liam lifted his gaze, not directly at her, but near her. Enough for her to sense he was present without invading her space. "You survived," he whispered, voice steady. "So did I. Maybe that's enough for today." Sable blinked. Not the slow blink of trust. Not yet. But a blink of awareness. A blink that said, "I hear you." For a bobcat who had refused everyone, it was the start of something almost miraculous. Nora, watching through the small window in the door, covered her mouth with her hand. She'd never seen Sable respond like that. Not once, not even in the dead of night when the world was quietest. Something had shifted in that room. Something gentle and unmistakably real. And this was only the beginning, because after that day, Liam didn't disappear back into the forest. He returned, again and again, sometimes with nothing more than a book, sometimes with only his voice, sometimes just to sit on the floor while Sable decided whether she could trust the world a little more. The rebuilding of that trust would happen in the smallest steps imaginable, and each one would bring them closer to a bond that neither of them could have foreseen. If this moment between Liam and Sable touches something in you, stay with me. What grows next, blink by blink, breath by breath, is where the heart of this story truly begins to unfold. Trust doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't burst open or announce itself. Sometimes it begins as a tiny change in breathing, a quiet look, the slow, careful blink of a creature who has every reason to turn away. And in the days after Liam knelt in that dim recovery room, Sable, a bobcat who had refused every rescuer, began offering gestures so small they almost slipped past the eye. Yet each one carried the weight of something miraculous. The day after their first meeting, Liam walked back into the wildlife center with the same steady footsteps, the same jacket, carrying the faint scent of smoke, and the same quiet presence that seemed to settle the air around him. He didn't know whether Sable would remember him. He didn't expect anything. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, the staff noticed something unusual. Sable's ears moved. Not in fear, not in startle. In recognition, it was subtle, like the turning of a leaf or the ripple of grass in a soft breeze. But for a creature who had kept her body locked tight, the tiny movement felt enormous. A sign that something inside her was beginning to thaw. Liam lowered himself to the floor again, just as before. No sudden motions, no attempts to coax her out. He simply sat cross-legged, a few feet from the crate, breathing slowly, letting the stillness ease into the room. "Morning," he whispered. Nothing more. Sable didn't approach him. She didn't shift her weight, but her eyes, once distant and unfocused, found him. Only for a moment, but long enough for the others to see it. Animals in trauma measure the world in fractions. The first look, the first breath that isn't held, the first moment their body softens by even a degree. These are the early signs of healing, invisible to most, unmistakable to those who've waited for them. In wildlife rehabilitation, progress often comes in small increments. A traumatized bobcat will not leap into trust. She won't purr or press against the crate bars or show affection the way a domestic pet might. Instead, she might show acceptance through stillness, by not retreating, by allowing proximity. For animals like Sable, who rely heavily on scent and subtle shifts in energy, feeling safe is a gradual process. Each encounter rewrites a small piece of memory. This presence doesn't harm me. This voice doesn't bring danger. This moment is quiet, and I am still alive within it. Trust builds not in leaps, but in breaths. On the third day, Liam brought a worn field notebook, the same one he'd carried through last year's fire season. Its pages smelled faintly of pine and smoke, like something that had survived along with him. He sat on the floor and opened it to a page filled with small, handwritten notes about trail markings and weather patterns. He began reading softly. Not a story, not anything poetic, just the steady sound of his voice describing wind directions, rainfall estimates, and animal tracks he'd seen after storms. Practical things, gentle things, words without threat. Sable listened. She didn't move closer, but her breathing changed. It slowed, deepened, became less sharp around the edges. Her shoulders, once hunched and rigid, softened. Her gaze drifted from the corner to the open space of the room, and then back to him. Through the glass panel, Nora whispered, "Look, she's not guarding the door anymore. She's curious." Curiosity in a wounded animal is a sign of returning life. It means the mind is waking up. Later that evening, long after Liam had gone, the camera caught Sable stepping forward. Not out, not all the way, but far enough that one paw rested near the front of the crate. She sniffed the air where Liam had been sitting, not frantically, carefully, deliberately. A wild animal's way of asking a question. Is the world shifting? Is there something here worth trusting? Healing often looks uneventful from the outside. A predator eats a few bites of food. A firefighter reading to a crate in a quiet room. These moments might seem small, but to the ones living inside them, they are monumental. There's something profoundly human about sitting in silence with a creature who doesn't speak your language, but understands your presence. It reminds us that kindness doesn't need translation, that loyalty doesn't require words, that love, in all its quiet, soulful forms, can appear in the most unexpected places. And for someone like Liam, who had spent months believing he failed more lives than he saved, watching Sable soften even slightly gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time: permission to breathe. Maybe he wasn't meant to rescue every creature he met. Maybe being a steady presence was enough. We often think of healing as something dramatic: breakthrough moments, big declarations, sudden clarity. But in real life, change is usually slow, gentle, earned, breath by breath, especially with wild animals who know instinctively that the world can be dangerous. When Sable blinked, slow, deliberate, soft, it wasn't simply a reflex. In feline behavior, a slow blink is a moment of trust, a moment of peace, a moment of saying, "You are not a threat." Liam didn't celebrate. He didn't even move for fear of breaking the spell. He only blinked back, and in that tiny exchange, something unspoken passed between them, a shared understanding that healing was possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. These were the kinds of heartwarming stories the center lived for, the kind that stitched torn edges back together. Over the next week, the milestones continued. Sable began eating a few bites while Liam was still in the room. She shifted her body so she faced him instead of the wall. She allowed a soft growl near a nurse, but didn't growl at him. And one morning, when the sun cast a thin beam of light across the crate, she relaxed enough to lie down fully, paws stretched forward, breathing slowly. These precious moments didn't resemble fairy tales or dramatic recoveries. They looked ordinary. But for those watching, they were extraordinary. Real progress doesn't need spectacle. It simply needs patience. And Liam seemed to understand that in his bones. But as Sable grew stronger, another question quietly rose in the staff's minds. How much of her healing depended on Liam's presence? And what would happen when she needed to return to the work wild, where no human voice, no familiar scent, no gentle guardian could follow? This question would take them back into the burned forest, where the land itself was trying to grow again, just like Sable, just like Liam. If these small steps toward trust touch something familiar in your heart, stay with me. The next chapter takes us into a forest, learning to breathe again, and shows how the healing of land and life can mirror each other in the most soulful, inspirational ways. Some places heal in ways so quiet you wouldn't notice unless you stopped long enough to listen. And sometimes the healing of the land becomes the mirror a person needs to understand their own wounded places. Out in the burned canyons of northern Arizona, a forest was learning how to breathe again. And without meaning to, Liam began learning alongside it. The fire had passed weeks ago, but its memory lingered across the landscape like the faint echo of a painful story. Charred trunks stood tall and silent, black against the bright blue sky. Ash clung to the ridgelines in soft gray drifts. And where the flames had run hottest, the earth carried a cracked, glassy sheen, fire's final signature. Most people avoided the burn zone. It was too raw, too somber. But on his days off, Liam found himself walking the ridges again. Not out of duty, not out of habit, but because something about the land felt familiar. Damaged, yes, but not defeated. He carried a small canvas bag, nothing more than water, and a notebook. His boots left prints in the powdered ash, and with each step, the ground puffed upward like a sigh. The forest sighed back. It wasn't the sigh of despair. It was the release that comes only after surviving something overwhelming. And if you looked closely, really looked, you would see hints that the forest was already fighting its way back toward life. A curl of green beneath a scorched log, a stubborn shoot of wild grass pushing through hardened earth. A young scrub oak is leafing out, despite its blackened trunk. Liam knelt beside one of those small shoots, brushing the soil lightly with his fingers. The texture was gritty, but not lifeless. Seeds long buried beneath the forest floor were waking now, stirred by heat and smoke. Some plants only sprout because fire tells them it's time. Nature has a way of starting over without asking permission. After a wildfire, the recovery of an ecosystem often happens from the ground up. Some pine cones require intense heat to open. Some grasses germinate only after smoke touches them. Birds return slowly, scouting from distant trees before choosing their perches again. Predators, like bobcats, wait until the smallest signs of prey return. Squirrels, quail, field mice, before re-establishing their territory. Trauma affects landscapes just as it affects living beings. The land retreats, then regrows. The spirit collapses, then stirs. The world burns, then breathes. Watching the forest rebuild itself gave Liam something he hadn't felt in months. Perspective. A sense that recovery wasn't about erasing what happened, but learning to grow around it. At one hillside bend, Liam paused to examine a fallen pine. Half its bark was burned away, revealing patterns he'd never noticed. Rings etched in caramel and charcoal. When he leaned closer, he saw something unexpected. A small paw print, barely visible, light as a whisper. A bobcat's. Not necessarily sables. There were others in the region, but seeing the print felt like a presence, like someone had walked this path before him, testing the world the same way he was. Liam knelt and placed his palm close to the print, not touching it, just acknowledging it. He remembered reading somewhere that wild cats often return to burn zones earlier than expected. They rely on instinct, on scent, on the knowledge that new growth brings new opportunity. Even animals deeply wounded by fire sometimes come back sooner than humans imagine. Back at the Wildlife Center, Sable's progress continued in small, steady ways. She ate more regularly. She shifted her body toward the light instead of the dark corner. She no longer avoided eye contact when Liam walked into the room. Nora once whispered to him, "She's different when you're here. Calmer, like something inside her rests." Each day, Liam would go from the recovering forest to the recovering bobcat. And something inside him began matching their rhythm. There is a quiet truth about healing. It doesn't happen in straight lines. It ebbs and flows. It hides, then returns. It surprises you on days you least expect. And sometimes, healing begins not because you sought it out, but because you stepped into the presence of something else trying to survive. For Liam, the forest was more than a place of work. It was a companion in recovery. Its slow, patient return to life mirrored the slow softening he felt around Sable. The land didn't hurry. It didn't pretend everything was fine. It simply kept growing in the ways it could, bit by bit. Watching this permitted Liam to stop expecting himself to move on from the fire all at once. Instead, he let himself grow around the memories. Like the pines pushing new needles from charred limbs, he didn't try to forget. He just tried to keep living. We often measure healing by what disappears. The pain, the scars, the fear. But real healing is often measured by what returns. Curiosity, calm, the desire to step outside again, the willingness to trust, even a little. Sable's progress at the center wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a gradual reawakening of instinct, a small stretch of her legs, a careful sniff of Liam's jacket, a slow blink that carried the softness of acceptance. In Sable, Liam saw something he didn't expect. Courage. Not the bold, heroic kind, but the kind that quietly says, "I'm willing to try again, even if I'm scared." The kind of courage that feels familiar to anyone who has walked through loss and come out carrying the same body, but a different heart. One afternoon, after walking the ridge, Liam returned to the center, carrying a sprig of young manzanita from a recovering hillside. Its leaves were red-tipped, resilient, a symbol of the desert's stubborn beauty. He placed it a few inches outside Sable's crate and sat back with his notebook. Sable approached the branch, not quickly, but with deliberate steps. Her whiskers twitched. She pressed her nose close, breathing in the scent of the forest that had nearly taken her. She didn't recoil. She didn't freeze. She simply breathed. A long, slow inhale, as if remembering something forgotten. Nora watched them with soft eyes. "She's reconnecting," she whispered. "Not just to you, to the world." And Liam realized she was right. But as Sable regained strength, the question of her future began to take shape. A bobcat cannot live in a rehabilitation center forever. She wasn't meant to be caged, not even for her own safety. The wild was calling her, even if it carried old memories of fire. The staff needed to decide when and how to return her to the land. And Liam, who had become the anchor she'd trusted, would have to face a different kind of letting go. If the image of a forest and a frightened bobcat healing side by side stays with you, keep listening. The next part brings us to the hardest and most hopeful moment of all, the release, and Sable's first days back in the wild she once feared. There comes a moment in every healing journey when holding on is no longer love, and letting go becomes the most loyal act a heart can offer. On a cool autumn morning, with the hills still carrying the scent of ash and new grass, Sable, the little bobcat who once refused every rescuer, stood at the doorway of her freedom. And the hills, usually alive with birds and breeze, held their breath, as if they understood the weight of what was about to happen. The decision to release Sable hadn't come quickly. For weeks, the staff spoke in careful tones about her progress, measuring her behavior against what a wild soul needed to survive. Physically, she was strong again. Her wounds had healed into pale lines, hidden beneath growing fur. Her muscles regained their quiet power. She moved with the grace of an animal who remembered the rhythm of the land. But the question everyone whispered was the one no chart could answer. Would she manage without Liam? Sable had learned to eat in his presence, to breathe evenly when he entered the room, to blink slowly in a gesture of trust. She still didn't tolerate the other staff unless he was near. Her trauma had softened, not vanished. And releasing an animal with a bond, however gentle, with a human, carried risks. Yet keeping her caged carried different risks. A bobcat is not meant for walls, even kind ones. Her spirit needed open sky, the soft rustle of brush, the pulse of earth under paws. To deprive her of that would be another kind of wound. So the staff made their decision with equal parts hope and fear. Sable would be released into a protected reserve, one close enough for monitoring, but wild enough to belong fully to her. And Liam, he would be there. Releasing a wild animal after trauma isn't a simple event. It's a carefully measured process, shaped by science, instinct, and respect. Biologists check territory availability, prey density, and distances from human development. They monitor behavior patterns, hunting attempts, vocalizations, stress responses, and most of all, they look for signs that the animal has reclaimed enough of its wildness to stand on its own. For Sable, those signs came slowly, but steadily. She stalked, moving feathers placed in her enclosure. She reacted alertly to distant sounds. She established routines that mirrored her natural patterns, and she no longer hid when the staff observed from afar. But the most telling sign was this. When Liam stood near the crate one afternoon, reading quietly, she didn't press her body toward the bars. She lay calmly, but at a distance. That small space between them, that was independence beginning to bloom. The release was planned for late afternoon, when the sun softened and shadows stretched gently across the ground. The reserve chosen for her was a quiet basin just beyond the restored forest line, an area rich with cottonwoods, creek beds, and enough prey to give her a fair chance. Liam carried the crate from the truck. The others gave him space. This was a moment the center understood belonged to him and Sable alone. He set the crate down in a patch of grass where sunlight fell warm and even. The air smelled of pine resin, cool earth, and the faint sweetness of autumn leaves beginning to turn. Sable stayed still inside, but her whiskers twitched once, catching the scent of open space. Liam crouched beside her, not kneeling this time, but resting one hand lightly on the ground. "You're ready," he said quietly. "More ready than you know." He didn't reach in, didn't coax, didn't make it about himself. He simply opened the crate door and moved back. For a long moment, nothing happened. Sable's golden eyes reflected the forest ahead, wide and bright. Her body remained crouched, every muscle listening. She didn't bolt. She didn't hesitate in fear. She simply paused. The kind of pause predators take when choosing their path. Then she stepped out. One paw into the grass. Then another. Slow, measured, certain. Her nose lifted to the wind, catching scents that belonged to her. Soil, water, birds, the promise of wild things. She took a few more steps, each one a quiet declaration of who she had been before the fire, and who she was returning to now. Liam watched her with a stillness that came from equal parts pride and ache. When she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped and turned back. Not because she was unsure, not because she wanted comfort, but because some connections are worth acknowledging, even if they were born from pain. Liam met her gaze with the softest of nods. And just like that, she disappeared into the brush, silent as wind. There are moments in life that feel like holding a delicate breath. Letting Sable go was one of those moments. It carried the sweetness of success and the sting of goodbye. Healing had brought them together, and healing would send them apart. But that's the nature of love in its truest sense. Kindness without possession, presence without expectation, loyalty without chains. The heartwarming part wasn't the release itself, but the fact that she walked into freedom with the courage she hadn't possessed when they first found her curled in the shadows. Liam stayed kneeling in the grass long after she vanished. Not grieving, not lost, just quiet. Because some silences are sacred. People often think release days are celebrations. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're more like blessings. Soft, humble, thoughtful. You don't clap or cheer for a wild animal returning home. You whisper hope into the wind and trust it knows where to carry it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, the entire forest seemed to pause. Even the birds quieted, coasting into their roosting spots with careful wings. The wind softened to a hush. It was as if the hills themselves honored the moment, a small bobcat reclaiming the life she nearly lost. And the stillness that followed wasn't emptiness. It was gratitude. The kind nature shows when something is restored. But the story didn't end at the clearing, because freedom is not a single moment. It's a learning curve, and Sable's first nights alone in the vast, repaired wild would test every instinct she had regained. What she found out there, and what Liam discovered in her absence, would shape the final chapter of their connection. If Sable's quiet walk into freedom touched your heart, stay with me. Her early days in the wild, and the moment she returns in a way no one expected, carry a kind of gentle power you won't want to miss. Some stories don't end where you expect. Some stories circle back, quietly, gently, like a wild creature stepping out of the trees, not because she must, but because something in her remembers where safety once lived. And sometimes, that return carries a message softer than words, but strong enough to change the way a person breathes. The weeks after Sable's release moved with a slow, steady rhythm. The Wildlife Center checked the tracking data each morning, watching her movements arc across the rolling foothills, weaving through creek beds and stands of young aspen. She was doing what a wild bobcat should, establishing a territory, stalking prey, sleeping beneath sheltered rock outcrops. Her path formed a loose circle around the reserve, widening a little more each day. Nothing erratic, nothing concerning, just the quiet pattern of a creature rediscovering herself. For Liam, life settled into something resembling calm. Not perfect, not absent from memory, but steadier. On early mornings, he'd walk the ridge, where manzanita leaves glowed red in the dawn. He noticed how the forest deepened in color as it recovered. Evergreens pushing brighter needles, fireweed blooming in hopeful purple streaks. The world wasn't erasing the fire. It was growing around it. He found comfort in that. Some evenings, when his shift ended early, he'd sit at the edge of the reserve, back against a smooth boulder that held the last of the day's heat. He never called out or waited expectantly. He simply sat, breathing, thinking, letting the land be what it was. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. And Sable? She kept her distance, as wild creatures should. Her sightings were captured only by trail cameras, a silhouette moving with liquid grace, whiskers catching moonlight, fur thick and healthy again. Each clip was like a small promise, proof that she was living, thriving, reclaiming the life she was meant to have. Still, something in her behavior hinted that her story with Liam wasn't finished. Wild animals form memories differently from humans. They don't bond the way we do, but they imprint experiences, especially experiences tied to survival. Scent, sound, and presence can embed themselves in the deep instinctual part of their mind. And while a bobcat doesn't feel loyalty the way people describe it, they do register safety. They remember who approached them with gentleness instead of force, who offered calm instead of fear, who remained still when the world was overwhelming. Sable's memory of Liam wasn't sentimental. It was something more primal. A recognition that his presence meant life when she had been close to giving up. This kind of connection does not pull a wild bobcat out of the woods often. But sometimes, once in a great while, it brings her close enough to be seen. It happened one early summer morning, nearly a full year after the fire. The air was cool enough to mist, and the sun hadn't yet lifted above the mountains. Liam had taken a break from his patrol to rest on the ridge, sipping from a dented metal thermos. The forest around him felt new again. Birds called from high branches, wind threaded through the grass in silver ripples. Everything carried a gentleness that made the hard seasons feel far away. He set the thermos beside him and looked out across the valley. He wasn't searching for her. He wasn't expecting her, but something, a soft footfall, a shift in the air, made him turn his head. And there she was. Sable stood just beyond a cluster of low juniper shrubs, her fur brushed with gold by the rising sun. She looked nothing like the trembling creature he'd first seen in that dim recovery room. Her coat was full, her stance is confident. Her eyes were bright and aware, but what struck him most was her calm. She wasn't crouched or defensive. She wasn't deciding whether to flee. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her presence sure, like a flame softened into warmth. She took one step forward. Just one. Then sat, tail curled neatly around her paws. Liam didn't move, didn't speak. He had learned long ago that silence was a language too. For a long moment, they simply shared the space between them. A man carrying scars from a fire he once thought defined him, and a bobcat who had risen from her own ashes, trusting only one person long enough to remember him this way. Sable's ears turned slightly toward the wind. She blinked, slow, deliberate, gentle. It was not a plea, not a question, not even a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement. a quiet offering of acceptance, a reminder that some connections leave marks as real as any scar, marks that don't hurt, but guide. Then, just as softly as she had appeared, she stood, stepped back into the brush, and vanished, like a breath fading into air. Liam let out a slow exhale he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Not sadness, not longing, just peace. Because sometimes the most meaningful moment is not when someone arrives or stays, but when they return only long enough to let you know they're all right. There is something sacred about being seen by a wild animal, truly seen. It reminds us that kindness leaves traces, even when we can't see them. It reminds us that healing is not a straight path, but a shared one. And it reminds us that love, whether between humans or between a person and the natural world, doesn't need ownership or words to exist. Sable's return didn't erase the fire. It didn't erase the fear, or the long nights, or the ache of things lost, but it brought a kind of forgiveness. Quiet, instinctive, profound. Not forgiveness of a person, but forgiveness of a moment in time, a way for both of them to set down what they'd carried. Some wounds we heal from, some we learn to walk with, but some become reminders of who we've become. Sable had become wild again. Liam had become whole again. And the forest, still growing, had become a sanctuary for them both. Stories like this, stories of kindness, loyalty, wildness, and second chances, remind us that the world is still filled with heartwarming miracles. Not loud ones, and a bond made not of words, but of presence. This is the kind of tale that lingers, a reminder that even after devastation, beauty grows back, stronger. And sometimes, those we rescue end up rescuing us in return. As you sit with this story, I invite you to reflect on a simple question. Who or what has helped you heal when you needed it most? If this journey between a wild bobcat and a weary firefighter touched, and if you feel moved to help creatures like Sable, animals who survive fire, fear, and the harsh edges of the world, consider leaving a super thanks or supporting the rescue centers that heal these beautiful, wild souls. Your kindness helps keep their stories alive,